Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm continuing my series about GCSE history, international relations between the wars. So, summing up the Treaty of Versailles. It was signed by the Allies on one side and Germany on the other. So it was somewhat harsh, could have been rather harsher, which is what most of the French wanted. It could have been a bit more lenient, as some of the Americans wanted. It was about right, so far as the British were concerned, because they were midway between the two other positions. The French insisted that the Germans would be made to suffer, since they'd visited so much suffering on the French. And that's the way people seem to view it, just these blanket condemnations of another country and not distinguishing between the innocent and the guilty. But a huge amount of damage had been done. It had to be paid for. Who was to pay for it? Well, the country that caused it. And the French would claim the other country caused it. The Germans might say it's the Allied countries caused it. But what was to be done? Someone has to pick up the bill. The French had the most vengeful attitude. Anyway, so the French desire to really hammer Germany was moderated by the British and more so by the Americans. So President Wilson got some of his 14 points incorporated into the treaty, such as the creation of Poland. But still, this was so objectionable, much of the rest of the treaty, that Wilson refused to sign it. The United States later concluded a separate peace with Germany in rather more moderate terms called the Treaty of Berlin. As a result of that, relations between Germany and the United States were quite cordial in the 1920s, much more so than between Germany and her other erstwhile enemies. Anyway, so the Allies had negotiated amongst themselves what terms to impose on Germany. They hadn't negotiated with Germany. The German delegation was allowed to be there and simply to listen, not to interject. The Germans were told they must accept or reject the entire treaty as a package. They couldn't cherry-pick it, agree to some sections and not others. So the Germans said this was peace by diktat. That's why it was dictated to them. They weren't allowed to parley with the Allies about what they'd agreed to. But the German situation in June 1919 was so parlous that the German delegation in Paris was ordered to sign by their government back in Berlin. Germany was teetering on the brink of a civil war. It was close to total economic collapse. The Allies had kept up the blockade. The Royal Navy was still there, not allowing ships into Germany or out of Germany to bring in food or to send German exports abroad to earn money. So the Allies had kept their stranglehold on the German windpipe, choking them. The treaty was unpleasant for Germany, to say the least. Well, it was supposed to. So Lloyd George, Clemenceau and Orlando saw as punishment. They thought it would teach Germany a moral lesson for all time, and other would-be aggressors would know that if they offended international morality, there would be hell to pay. And the Kaiser, that's the German emperor who'd fled to the Netherlands, was to be put on trial for supreme offence against international morality. In fact, that didn't happen. Germany was allowed to put some of her other officers on trial for atrocities, which Germany did, but the sentences handed down were derisory, like 6 months in prison. Anyway, so the Germans signed it. They'd been in a far weaker position to fight in June 1919 than they had been in November 1918 when they signed the armistice, because the armistice had required them to hand over so many tanks, these many pieces of artillery, so many warships, even trucks and trains for transport. Allied prisoners in Germany had been immediately released in November 1918. Germans who were prisoners of war in Allied countries were not released until June 1919, until Germany had signed the Treaty of Versailles. So the German General Foch said, "This is not peace, it is a truce for 20 years. He was very perspicacious because he was right almost to the month. So here are some of the key terms of it, the treaty, in no particular order. Article 231, that's the war guilt clause, saying that Germany was entirely culpable for the war and the Allies were not remotely blameworthy for starting the war. And what principle flows from that? Well, it's the Pottery Barn principle. You broke it, well, you own it. As in, you caused all this harm, therefore you must pick up the tab. Think of all the widows and orphans who needed to be looked after. Think of all the soldiers being permanently disabled. Think of all the buildings needing to be repaired. Think of all the money that countries had to spend paying soldiers' salaries, buying their uniforms, paying for guns and all the rest of it. Now, the cost of that was so mind-blowing that the Allies didn't even attempt to get Germany to pay for all of that, but at least some of the damage. So Germany had to accept the principle of paying compensation, but the amount was not set at that time. The Allies impaneled the Allied Reparations Commission to calculate the cost of the war, and they would then hand Germany a whopping great bill. The Allied Reparations Commission reported in 1921 Germany had to pay £6.6 billion sterling. Why not set it in German currency? It was marks back then, because then Germany could simply print currency and devalue their currency and pay with almost worthless banknotes. So the Germans lost some territory. It was to make Germany less easy to defend in the event of a future war. Part of the idea was that, and then Germany wouldn't want another war. And the Allies were made more defensible. France got Alsace-Lorraine back, which was one of the primary French objectives for fighting this war, although the people who lived there would often say we're not French or German, we're Alsatian, not like the dogs. Incidentally, we used to call German shepherds until the First World War, so at that time that people started to call them Alsatian because they didn't want anything to be German. Anyway, it was a great rejoicing for the French that Alsace-Lorraine had been liberated, as they see it. It's 2 departments in eastern France, beside the River Rhine, as in next to Germany. The French had felt it was their bounden duty to rescue the people of Alsace-Lorraine. So the French army had marched into Strasbourg, the main city there, and the city was festooned with French tricolor. France also gained the Saarland, which was a rich coal mining district of western Germany. Coal back then was almost as important as oil is now. Trains, sometimes ships, factories, domestic heating, it's all relied on coal. Oil wasn't used very much. But the Saarland was to be French for 15 years. Then a plebiscite would be held, a vote, in which the Saarlanders would be able to decide France or Germany. I won't spoil the result yet. You have to see a future video. So much German territory to the east was taken to create Poland, the Polish corridor. Danzig, a city which was 90% ethnically German, was to be under the control of the League of Nations. It ended up being effectively controlled by Poland. But that was Poland's access to the sea. All Germany's overseas colonies were taken. These were what we now call Cameroon, Tanzania, Namibia, Papua New Guinea, the Marianas Islands, that's in the Pacific Ocean, a Chinese port called Qingdao, and anywhere else, Togo in West Africa. The League of Nations was to have these as mandates, and they were to give mandates or orders to other countries to govern these nations. So the French, British, Australian, South Africans, and Japanese were to rule these various territories and lead them towards independence. Now, that was in advance, because these colonizing countries had no particular thought of their colonies becoming independent any day. But even when people said, okay, we agree to the principle that these colonies will be independent in the future, many people assumed that was centuries away. It was taken as axiomatic by many in the Western world that whites were better at governance, should rule other races. It seemed to be a scandalous attitude to many people today. But they would say, well, look at these European countries, we've had better technology, our scientific discoveries are more advanced and so forth. So we are helping these people by providing them with superintendents. The Chinese were very miffed that their port of Qingdao was given to Japan, because it'd been Chinese till a few decades before. Almost everybody who lived in Qingdao was Chinese. They still produced passable German beer there. Why shouldn't it go to China? Why does it go to Japan? China had been on the Allied side too, but contributed almost no soldiers, some labourers. Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, taken from the Ottoman Empire, made British mandates. Syria and Lebanon were made French mandates. Looking onto the Rhineland, that's the western edge of Germany. The River Rhine flows through it. It was to be occupied by the French for 15 years. The French would withdraw a bit after 5 years. If Germany was still behaving, the French would withdraw even more after 10 years. And if Germany was still behaving, the French would withdraw completely after 15 years. So a phased withdrawal. And this was contingent on Germany honouring the terms of the treaty. Who was to judge if the Germans were behaving themselves? Well, the French were to be the judges of that. And if the Germans did not play ball, the French were under no obligation to withdraw ever. But even after the French completely pulled out, the Germans were never, ever to be able to station a single soldier or store any weapons in the Rhineland, because it was beside France, and the French didn't want to be menaced by the German army again. Anyway, so that was that. So that was to be a demilitarized zone in future. Another thing, Anschluss was forbidden. Anschluss is literally connection. That would be unification between Germany and Austria. Why would these countries want to unite? Well, what's the language of Austria? I always get a pupil who says Austrian. Well, there's no such language. It's German. So they have a great affinity for each other. They've got so much in common. Some people would even argue that they're the same country. They'd been somewhat united before when a thing called the Holy Roman Empire had existed for centuries up until 1806. So some people regard the Austrians as a kind of German, that they're being ethnically German and all the rest of it. Because if Austria and Germany united, it would be a larger, mightier country, a more potent foe in the future, and the Allies would quite like to see the Germans and Austrians quarrelling instead of cooperating. Another point, German industry was to be gravely restricted. Before the war, Germany had been the second mightiest industrial country in the world, the United States being the industrial powerhouse of the world at the time, the United Kingdom being a distant third. But Germany was knocked back, the UK resumed the number 2 spot. The aim was to prevent Germany being able to manufacture lots of weapons in future. There's also been less competition for Allied countries who are trying to win back markets they'd had to neglect after the First World War, because during the Great War, Allied countries had been producing weapons like bilio, had very little capacity to produce anything else. So the German army was to be restricted to 100,000 soldiers, no tanks, no poison gas, no general staff. All the soldiers had to serve for 20 years, so you couldn't train people for a year and send them out to civilian life, because they need to quickly build up a large pool of militarily trained men. And also men who've been in for 20 years, been in their late 30s, less physically fit than teenagers. The Navy was limited to 36 ships, only 6 of which were battleships, and they all had a limited displacement, as in size. No submarines whatsoever, no air force. You couldn't fight a 20th century war without air cover. All the land that Germany had seized from Russia in 1918 was taken back. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, was annulled. So was the Treaty of Bucharest, signed in May 1918, when the Germans had knocked Romania out of the war. So new countries were created out of the former Russian Empire: Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland. Some land went to Poland. Sometimes they weren't completely new, they were recreated, I should say. So that was that.